Hey everybody, it's the Culinary Shut-In here. Thank you for joining me for my first video recipe of something that I find to be tried and true and delicious. Today's recipe is by King Arthur Flour and it's called No Knead Crusty White Bread. I am not a bread maker, but I will tell you right now that this bread is so easy and so delicious that for my bread maker friends, it is now their go-to recipe. So I hope you enjoy it, and here we go. This is a batch that I just mixed up, and we'll go through some of the steps to mixing it, but the recipe is really flexible. It makes enough dough for 3 loaves of bread. I personally only get 2 loaves of bread out of it because I choose to bake mine in a cast iron pot, and I'll show you that later in the recipe. But truly a very delicious bread, and one that you can easily make. To make this recipe, you only need 4 ingredients, and most, if not all of these ingredients, you probably already have in your pantry. The first ingredient is flour, and for this recipe, you really only need all-purpose flour. I'm using bread flour today because I happen to have more bread flour in my pantry than I do all-purpose right now. But it turns out exactly the same regardless of the kind of flour that you use. The second ingredient you need is salt. The third ingredient is rapid rise yeast. Now this might be the one ingredient you don't have in your pantry, but the good news is this is something you can actually get delivered from Amazon. They might be out of everything else, but rapid rise yeast is something that can be delivered in a timely fashion. The final ingredient is water. I use tap water. And so let's get started. We'll show you how easy this dough is to mix and how we go from there. Okay, so as you can see here, I have all my ingredients laid out. I use a scale because I like to measure my ingredients. And this recipe calls for 907 grams of flour. Now, check the recipe, but I believe that's equal to about 7.5 cups. So if you don't have a scale, you can use cups. To this mixture, you're going to add 1 tablespoon of salt and 1.5 tablespoons of yeast. And it's very important to get in there and give that a good stir so that the salt and the yeast get mixed up nicely with the flour and it's evenly distributed. So there you go. You can see we've got a nice mixed up concoction. Now we're going to add water to this mixture. And I use a meat thermometer so that I can ensure the water is at 105 degrees. But you're just going to dump that water all in at once, and you're going to need a nice heavy spoon so that you can stir this mixture. Now it's a very sticky, thick mixture, and so you really have to get in there and give it, a really good stir. Now, and I'll be honest with you, sometimes I get pretty frustrated with this because no matter how hard I stir, I still have flour on the bottom. And so that is when I do what my Italian grandmother would have done, which is to take the spoon out, clean it off, and use my very freshly washed hands to mix this up. So just get your hand in there and, scrape the bottom so that you get all of the remaining flour. And, it doesn't have to be perfect. I have failed to get all the flour from the bottom, and I still end up with really beautiful bread. And as you can see, this dough is very sticky. There's the dough, shaggy dough. You'll love this. So you are going to leave this dough covered on your counter for 2 hours. It's going to rise very nicely, and after those 2 hours, it is time to put it in the refrigerator. Okay, our dough's been in the refrigerator for about 24 hours. There's no real requirement for it to be in the refrigerator longer than 2 hours after it sits on the counter for 2 hours. But like I said, this is a really flexible dough, and you can bake it anytime over 7 days. So what you'll see we have here is a really nice, well-risen, soft dough. It's very pliable and flexible. And as I mentioned, I personally like to bake one loaf in a cast iron pan and the second loaf in the oven. So today I'm going to show you both ways. The first thing we do for the loaf that you put in the cast iron pan, and I'll set my scale to pounds and ounces, is to separate out, using your hands, about 2 pounds of the dough. And this dough, you'll see, is very stretchy. You just pull it apart. You can't screw it up. I like to put a little bit of flour on this parchment paper so it doesn't stick. So let me see what we've got here. We need just a little bit more. Ah, perfect, 2 pounds, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to take the dough, and I'm using another piece of parchment paper. We're going to get ready to shape the first loaf, which is for the cast iron pan. And be generous with flour on this parchment paper because the dough is sticky. So I like to, place the dough on the parchment paper, kind of roll it around a little bit, absorb some of the flour, get rid of a little bit of the stickiness. And don't be afraid to use flour here. And then basically what I do is I create the seams on the bottom, and I form just a really nice, round, compact loaf of bread. Doesn't have to be perfect. It will become perfect, believe it or not. But just create a nice, round loaf of bread, and that bread right now is probably going to double in size in an hour and a half when we finally bake it. So that is the 2-pound loaf for the cast iron pan. Looks pretty good. Okay, now we're going to make the traditional loaf. So you're going to take the remaining dough that you have in your bucket. And once again, we're going to use parchment paper with a nice healthy dose of flour on it. Now, this is does not need to be as thick a flour coating because we're actually going to bake this loaf on the parchment paper, and that will either be on a baking stone or on a cookie sheet depending on what you have. So you can really make any shape loaf you want. I'm going to kind of stretch this one out and make like a little mini French loaf. It's like playing with Play-Doh. You can really kind of do anything that you want. But you're going to get your loaf all nice and shaped and ready to go into the oven in about an hour and 30 minutes. So that's all there is to it. We have 2 loaves of bread, cast iron one and a traditional loaf. Okay, let's talk about how you bake these loaves. As I mentioned, there's 2 different ways to do this. If you don't have a lot of kitchen accessories, you can bake the loaves on a cookie sheet. I happen to use a baking stone, and either is fine. But what is important when baking an open loaf in the pan is to have moisture so that you get a nice crusty loaf. So what's really critical is having a cup of boiling hot water in a pan below the loaf so that you can get the best possible outcome. Doesn't matter if you have a baking stone or a cookie sheet, either will work just fine. The other way to cook the loaf of bread is in a cast iron pan. I'm using a Staub cast iron pan. I actually put this in the oven for half an hour before I bake the bread. Now that the oven's preheated to 450, we take the cast iron pan out of the oven and remove the lid. Be careful, it's very hot. You have to prepare the pan. I use olive oil spray that I get at Barron's, but any cooking spray would work. You could even use butter if you wanted to. And then I put a little cornmeal on the bottom. If you don't have cornmeal, don't worry about it. You can use semolina flour or you can use nothing at all. The loaf will come out of the pan. So what I like to do is I like to lift the loaf up and place it in the pan. Now, what's really important for the look of the loaf is to use a razor blade or a really sharp knife to cut slits in the loaf so that it opens up and gives you that beautiful crusty loaf look when you bake it. So now that I've put the slits on that, we're going to put the lid back on this cast iron pan and we're going to put that in the oven for 25 minutes. So I wish we had smell-o-vision because this bread smells so good when it's in the oven. Now we're going to get ready to cook the second loaf. Once again, I'm going to use the razor blade. I'm going to cut 3 slits in the loaf so that we get a nice, we have, the loaf opens up very nicely. It doesn't look that pretty, but it will when it's cooked. And remember, I'm going to keep the loaf on the parchment paper. So I'm picking up the parchment paper and I'm placing it on my baking stone. This could also be a very hot cookie sheet. And I get that all positioned in the pan. And then I take 1 cup of boiling water and I pour that into the skillet that I've placed under the loaf of bread. This moisture is really critical for a good crusty loaf of bread. So now we've got the second loaf of bread in the oven, and like I said, smell-o-vision, here we come, because it smells amazing. About 25 minutes into baking, you're going to take the lid off the loaf that's in the cast iron pan. The bread is baked, but it's not brown yet, and so you're going to put an additional 10 minutes on that loaf of bread. So after about 28 or 30 minutes, the loaves are ready to come out of the oven. You see that our traditional loaf has come out and it looks beautiful. We're going to get the loaf of bread out of the cast iron pan. Do this right away when it comes out of the oven. I just use a spatula and kind of scoop it up, and using my other hand, place it on the cooling rack, and look how beautiful that loaf of bread is. Gosh, I can't wait to have some of that. So the next thing that comes after that, and the proof of the pudding, is in the eating. So here we go. Hello, Cole. Hello, Cooley. You want to taste the bread and let everybody know what you think, okay?
Okay. Whatever.
Well, that kind of says it all. And here you go, folks. The King Arthur No Knead Crusty White Bread. I want to thank you for bearing with me as I've done my first video recipe blog. I hope you enjoy this loaf of bread, and I've learned from filming this that maybe next time I need to get dressed up a little bit more.